18th, 2006. My name is Rosalind Benjet. We are at the JCC of Dallas to take the oral history of Nancy Kasten. Our videographer is Ruth Andrus, and we have in presence of Sherry Roost and Harriet Gross, who are writing articles for our event. Nancy, tell me about your family. You're from Massachusetts, right?
Yes, I was born in Boston, and to Jack and Shirley Kasten. My mother is from Newport, Rhode Island originally, actually born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then grew up in Newport. And my dad was born and raised in New York City and Queens. And they met when my mother was a nurse or in nursing school in Boston, and my dad was a healthcare administrator. And they lived in Quincy when I was born. My mother grew up in Newport and was part of the Toro Synagogue in Newport. And my parents were married at the Toro Synagogue, and I was named at the Toro Synagogue. And my grandmother continued to live in Newport until I was about 8 years old, when she moved to Quincy also. And my paternal grandparents lived in New York until my grandmother died. Both my grandmothers died when I was around 13, right around my bat mitzvah. And my maternal grandfather died before I was born, and my paternal grandfather actually came and lived with us for some time, and then ended up moving to Florida. But I was born at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, lived in Quincy as a baby, and then we moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for about 5 years. Two brothers who were born in Pittsburgh, and then moved back to Boston in 1965 and lived in Newton, was raised in Newton, and lived there till I graduated from high school in 1978.
Mm-hmm. Now, how about your family's arrival in the United States? Tell me about your family's arrival in the United States. Do you know anything about when your ancestors arrived?
Yes. All my grandparents were born out of the country. They all immigrated to the United States. I don't know a lot about my mother's father, the one who died before my parents were married even. But he had a large family, and they all came together sometime from somewhere in Poland or Russia, in that neighborhood. And maybe from their name was Winograd. So I think there was a town, and I don't know if they, Winogradov or something like that, I don't know if they were actually from there or not. But so my maternal grandfather came sometime in the early 1900s, and I believe all my grandparents came through Providence, Rhode Island. And my mother's father settled in Massachusetts area, New Bedford area, and then moved to Newport, and my grandfather opened a small store in Newport. And my maternal grandmother came, the family story is that she was one of many children, and she had an uncle who was going to be coming to the United States, and she was a young girl at the time, maybe 11 or 12. And her uncle said to her, well, if you sing me a song, I will bring you with me to the United States. And she did so, and she came to the States with him and left her whole family behind in Russia, and met my grandfather pretty soon after she arrived. I mean, she was a pretty young bride, I think. And the rest of her family stayed in Russia, and they lost contact during the war. And after the war, actually a long time after the war, in the 1970s, just maybe a year or two after my grandmother died, her family found my aunt and my mother. I guess through the Red Cross, they reestablished a relationship, and my aunt went to visit our family in the former Soviet Union sometime around 1976, and then in around 1978, one of my grandmother's sisters and brother-in-law and their son immigrated to the States and lived in Brooklyn. And then in 1988, another brother, my grandmother's brother, moved here with his daughter and son-in-law and wife, and two grandchildren. And actually they live now in Chicago. I just saw them this weekend. I was in Chicago for bat mitzvah, so I saw my grandmother's brother, who is now around 90 years old, and his wife and their kids, and then two other brothers. No, that's not true. I guess everybody else stayed in the former Soviet Union, but some of the next generation emigrated to Israel. So there were two brothers who went, my mother's cousins who immigrated to Israel. So that's my mother's side of the family. My father's parents met in Russia. And my grandfather had been in the Russian army. They immigrated, I think, in 1917. And my grandfather came with my grandmother's family. So his family also stayed behind, and I have no idea what happened to that part of the family. The name was Kastelyan in the former Soviet Union, and he came with my grandmother's family, my grandmother, two sisters, and her parents. And they came through Providence, but then settled in, I guess first, well, they started a laundry somewhere around Beekman Place in New York City. And my dad was born in Harlem, and then they lived near the laundry, and then eventually moved to Queens. And he was an only child. My mother had one sister, my father was an only child. They're both still living. And my grandfather, my father's father, was a furrier. And so that was his trade.
Mm-hmm.
But he never, as far as I know, he never established any contact with any of his nuclear family. He had cousins and other relatives here in the States that we've been connected to.
Let's talk about your schooling. Where did you start school in Pittsburgh or back in Massachusetts?
I was in nursery school in Pittsburgh, but we moved to Boston, to Newton, when I was going into kindergarten. So mm-hmm. I started in kindergarten in the Newton public school system, went all the way through high school. Attended Mason Rice Elementary School, which still exists as an elementary school, and then Weeks Junior High School, which now is an assisted living facility. So maybe I could go back there someday. And then Newton South High School, and graduated in 1978, and then went to Johns Hopkins University undergraduate in Baltimore. And I was a natural sciences and public health major at Johns Hopkins, never thinking about the rabbinate, and after graduation, worked for 2 years in New Haven at Yale Medical School, working with their faculty practice plan, kind of going into my family's business, the healthcare field. And then after a couple of years in New Haven, that's when I started thinking about applying to rabbinical school.
Well, let's go back and talk about the Jewish experiences that you had while you were in school. Did you go to Hebrew school, Sunday school? Did your family belong to a synagogue?
Well, my parents both grew up in traditional Jewish homes, not particularly observant or ritually oriented, but certainly by culture, kept kosher, kept the holidays, etc. But my parents were, very typical, I think, of first generation Americans, and really were not particularly connected to Jewish institutions as a young couple raising their own family and not living, near their parents. So we knew we were Jewish, obviously, and Newton was a very heavily Jewish community. So I went to school with a lot of Jewish kids, and we had Jewish neighbors and all of that, but not a particularly observant household. I actually asked my parents if I could go to Sunday school and Hebrew school. When I was in 4th grade, I started, and we joined Temple Israel of Boston, which is a old established synagogue, Reform synagogue in Boston. And we lived in Newton, so part of the fun of it was that I took public transportation, and I went Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoon, and I guess usually on Sundays my parents would drive us to Sunday school, but I have, again, strong memories of taking the T to Hebrew school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and so I fairly quickly regretted my request of my parents. Like most kids, I didn't particularly love Hebrew school or religious school, but I was, I guess I felt a strong connection to Judaism. And then, and again, we were not particularly observant, didn't observe Shabbat in our home growing up. We always had Passover and Hanukkah, the high holidays, and that was pretty much it. Again, but very culturally connected to the Jewish community. And I had a friend who I met in 7th grade, who's still a very close friend, whose family was Orthodox, and they always celebrated Shabbat and went to synagogue, and I spent a lot of time at her family's home, and that's really where I learned, what it meant to observe Shabbat on Friday night and that kind of thing. And she's still a very, very close friend. We kind of grew up as sisters, and then in confirmation, I really connected to. I had a good relationship with the rabbis and the cantor, and my rabbi at the time was Roland Gittleson, who again was one of the sort of legendary rabbis of his time, and a huge Zionist. And he was part of the movement to make the Reform movement a Zionist movement when it had not been originally. And he had established a program where he gave scholarships to confirmation students to become exchange students in Israel in junior year of high school. It's the Eisendrath International Exchange Program through the Union for Reform Judaism, then the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And the program still exists actually for high school students, but it's a lot different now than it was then. But at the time, I got this scholarship to go to Israel for 6 months, and I went from I guess June, well actually I left for Israel on the day of the Entebbe hijacking, the Air France hijacking. It was exactly 30 years ago. We were in Israel this summer, so really relived some of those experiences, from 30 years ago, thinking about that summer and how intense that was. see, I saw some of the people who were on that program with me, and the rabbi who took us, and all of those kinds of things, and it was really very nostalgic. But so we left, I think it was the 4th of July actually of 1976, and we spent 2 months in an intensive Hebrew language program in Ulpan at the Benjet Youth Village, which is a fairly well-known place in Israel, right near the airport in Lod, and a place where it was a school for kids whose parents really couldn't afford to educate them well, and a lot of notable Israelis actually went through Benjet. But in the summer there was this Ulpan set up, and learned Hebrew, traveled all around the country, and then after about 2 months in the Ulpan, we moved into cities and kibbutzim, and I lived in Jerusalem with a family and went to high school in Israel in Jerusalem for 4 months. And that was an amazing experience, and very much an experience that solidified my Jewish identity. But and at the time, I do remember that I visited Hebrew Union College, which is the rabbinical school branch in Jerusalem, and there was one young woman from my congregation in Boston who was in the rabbinic program. But I was there in 1976, and women began being ordained in the Reform movement in 1972. So it was a very, very new thing, very unusual thing, not something that I thought about doing myself at all. But once I got back to the States after this experience in Israel, I did get much more involved in my synagogue and was active in my youth group through high school. And then when I went to college, I taught religious school, and when I graduated and moved to New Haven, I also was teaching in religious school and connected with the Hillel at Yale, and there was a rabbi named Jim Panett there who was very encouraging of me. And the other key thing that happened when I was in New Haven is that David Ruderman, who is a professor of Jewish history, also a rabbi, but also professor, had just started the Yale's program in Jewish Studies, academic program in Jewish Studies. It was one of the first academic programs in Jewish Studies of the new genre. You know, there were some long-standing Near Eastern Studies programs at Harvard and at Johns Hopkins, actually, which I never took advantage of. But this was the first, maybe the first Department of Jewish Studies in a major Ivy League institution or major college in the United States, and so he was just beginning that program, and I audited a course in modern Jewish thought that he was teaching, and it was a great course, and I really loved it. So I took this Jewish studies course that I loved, and then there was a woman who was the Jewish chaplain at Yale. Yale has, I think still has, a Jewish chaplain and a Catholic chaplain and a Protestant chaplain. Perhaps now they have others as well, but that were officially hired by the university. And the Jewish chaplain was a woman who, you know, one of the first women ordanees from the Reform movement, and Lori Ruderman, and I got to know her as well, and started thinking about some options for my future, and ended up starting to think about the rabbinate. Mm-hmm. So, David Ruderman, by the way, has subsequently moved to the University of Pennsylvania and runs one of the premier Jewish studies programs in the world, really, at the University of Pennsylvania. He's going to be a scholar in residence at Temple this year. And my sister-in-law now works for him. So everything comes back, and, you know.
Okay. Let's go back to your teenage years. What was the synagogue and the congregation and the service like at the time that you were growing up?
Well, as I said, I didn't really go to services that often at the time, but Temple Israel was right, you know, on the Brookline-Boston border, so an urban congregation, right in the heart of actually the medical area in Boston, walking distance to the hospital where I was born. And services were classical reform. But again, because Roland Gittleson was a Zionist and very interested in Hebrew, I mean, we used the Union Prayer Book, the old Union Prayer Book, but did have, a considerable amount of Hebrew in the service. It was not entirely in English the way I think Temple Emmanuel Dallas at one time was much more English oriented, I think. I don't know, but, and we did have a cantor. Murray Simon was our cantor, who came, I guess he came around the same time we joined the synagogue. And there was always an assistant rabbi, who was the young rabbi, who the kids, tended to identify with more. And I knew that congregation, that building, backwards and forwards. There was a high premium placed on decorum in services. Kids came, at a fairly young age. I remember going with my parents when I was, 4th grade and up. And my brothers were younger. I don't remember.
You have
but
brothers?
I have 2 brothers, 2 younger brothers.
Mm-hmm.
We're all fairly close in age, about 3 years between me and my youngest brother, so we're close in age. And but I do remember, I think about this a lot because now my kids, my son became a bar mitzvah in March, and my daughter will become a bat mitzvah next September. And I do remember that there were ushers in the congregation, and if there was any disruption of any kind, the ushers would come and kind of give you the hook. Or the rabbi would come down off the bima. They didn't have hakafot then. They didn't come off the bima automatically at the time of the Torah service. But the rabbi would occasionally, if warranted, come off the bima and come and stare at the offender, which was a very intimidating experience, even though Roland Gittleson was a very short man, but very authoritarian. And
And what kind of activities were you interested in as a teenager?
I was interested in a lot of activities. I played a lot of tennis. I worked on the school newspaper. I did quite a bit of writing. I did some student theater, mostly not acting, but directing. I played the cello until my 20s, basically. And so I was always in the school orchestra, played for all the school musicals. Our high school did a lot of the arts, and so I liked to be involved in the productions. And so that was,
What kind of interactions did your family have with other Jews?
My family was in the medical field, and when we lived in Newton. So we were kind of set up to interact on a regular basis with other Jewish families and Jewish people, but nothing, I remember my mother, especially my dad, was working. He worked at the Beth Israel Hospital for the first, 7 years when we moved to Boston, and then he became a vice president at Arthur D. Little, which is a consulting firm. And but my mother was involved with a bit with community politics and environmental issues. I remember we had a campaign to save the Vale. There was a, kind of a little Vale in Newton that was being encroached upon by developers, and so she did some community activities along those lines. She also worked as an RN she worked all the way through my growing up part-time, and so she would work nights when I was younger at the hospital and things like that. But I do not remember them being involved in any they were not involved in Israel or CJP or, you know, any of those kinds of, they were not involved particularly in the synagogue. They became more involved later on when Rabbi Gittleson retired, and then Rabbi Bernard Melman became the senior rabbi at our congregation when I was, I guess he came maybe when I was either a senior in high school or a freshman in college. And he and my parents really enjoyed each other. They are close friends now as well. And my parents got more involved in the congregation at that point, but they were not involved. I don't remember them being involved in any specific Jewish causes when I was a child.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've talked a little bit about some of the influences that set you off thinking about the rabbinate, and but what was it that made you decide?
Well, it happened over time, really, but what really initiated my interest, there were maybe 2 or 3 factors that came into play. I really had loved my Israel experience and wanted to go back to Israel. And one of the big draws for me of the rabbinic program, the Hebrew Union College rabbinic program, was that the first year would be in Jerusalem. And I also felt that I had minimal Jewish education, that I really wanted to know more about Judaism, Jewish life, Jewish history, Jewish ritual, that I really had not gotten a background in that in my upbringing and in the Jewish education that I had had, and that there was also, I'd been exposed to this, intellectual tradition that I had no concept of before through this, class in modern Jewish thought. And so it seemed that there was a lot of richness there to be mined, and a lot to be gained by entering into this program. And I really didn't know if I would finish it when I started it. And I think now, I'm actually on the board of governors of HUC now, and I know that, students go in with a lot more direction and a lot more understanding than I did at the time. Again, I started when the Yale program, Jewish Studies program, just started. There were none of these Jewish Studies programs that now exist, even here at SMU now, and now you see rabbinic students coming in with much deeper knowledge, academic knowledge especially, and also a different experience that they've had of Judaism through camps, which I never attended Jewish camps. So through camping and through their campus experiences. But when I went to school, the only way to be involved in college was through Hillel, and I was not particularly enamored of the Hillel at Johns Hopkins. Like a lot of other places, it was primarily geared toward much more observant Jews. So I had some interaction, but I did not really connect that through that. Mm-hmm. And I got off track. But I know. So I thought there was a lot to be gained by delving into Jewish education on a more serious basis. I could do it in a place that I wanted to go back to, that I loved, which was Israel. And I thought that being a rabbi would be a great way of, I saw a potential for me to connect the richness of Jewish tradition to people who, like me, may have grown up in an environment where they didn't even know that this richness was available to them. Mm-hmm. And so those were the kinds of things that intrigued me. And I also, I think, I always thought I would do something unusual. Growing up, I thought I would do something unusual that was not the usual thing for a woman to do. And so this fit the bill in a lot of ways. It was a big surprise for my parents. They didn't ever think about that, for me, and, said, what kind of job is that for a nice Jewish girl? And it was a sort of pioneering area at the time.
So you went to school in Cincinnati or
No,
in Israel?
I went the first year I went to Israel, and then there are 3 stateside campuses of HUC, one in Los Angeles, one in Cincinnati, one in New York. And so I attended the Los Angeles campus for 2 years of rabbinical school, and then I added a year and got a master's in Jewish education in Los Angeles. And then I transferred to the New York campus to be ordained. At the time I went to rabbinical school, you could not be ordained on the LA campus. Now you can, but at the time you had to transfer. If you went to LA, you had to transfer to one of the other 2 campuses to do your final 2 years and be ordained. So, so I had the LA experience and the New York experience.
And what was your favorite topic that you studied at that point? Did you have anything that intrigued you the most?
Well, I always loved studying Hebrew, all the different kinds of Hebrew, modern as well as biblical, rabbinic, and I was very interested in Midrash. I wrote my rabbinic thesis on Midrash, so that was probably my favorite area.
And how did you meet your husband?
I met my husband, well, he and I have different memories of this, but he does not remember that we actually met very briefly in New York when he had just come back. He was a year ahead of me in rabbinical school. We met in rabbinical school, and he was a year ahead of me in rabbinical school. He came back from his year in Jerusalem and made a presentation to the students who were leaving for their year in Jerusalem at the New York campus. And so he spoke about the experience, and so I met him then. I mean, I heard him then. I'm not sure we actually met. But we were actually, at that same time when I went to New York for this orientation that they did and where David spoke, I met a woman, Gail Pomerantz, who ended up being my roommate in Jerusalem. And she had made a connection through David's then girlfriend, Elaine Zecker, who's now a rabbi at Temple Israel in Boston. She knew Elaine from Brandeis, and she had arranged for us to rent the apartment that David had lived in with his roommate in Jerusalem. So we were supposed to actually, Gail and I were supposed to actually live in the apartment that David had lived in Jerusalem. But what happened was that when Gail got to Jerusalem before I did, and when she saw the apartment that David had lived in, she decided that it was not suitable for us, that it was not in good condition. And so she found us another apartment before I ever even got there. So, but that's a source of some joke in our household at times. If he lived in this pit, or made it into a pit. He claims that it was the person who lived there that summer that did the damage. But then he went on to LA for his second year, and in my second year I also went to LA. So we met in Los Angeles. We really met in Los Angeles. And that program in LA was pretty small. There were about 8 students in his year and about 8 in my year, and there were just 2 years of rabbinical school there. So everybody knew each other very, very well, and we were friends, just friends, and he, for his second and third year, he was in a student congregation in Santa Rosa, California, and then when he did the education year as well in LA, so the year he did his education year, I ended up being placed at the congregation in Santa Rosa, so we talked a lot about the congregation, and he helped, me understand some of the things I would be doing there, and so we became even better friends through that, and then he left and went to New York, and it was just in his last year of rabbinical school in New York, which was I went to New York as well, so it was my 4th year, his 5th year of rabbinical school. That's when we started dating, and Benjet part of the story is, I don't know, Ruth, if you've ever heard this, but we were dating kind of undercover because HUC is a fishbowl. We had also we had both been involved with other people, and you know, we didn't really want to make a big deal out of this relationship. It was his last year, and it was also fun to have a secret relationship in New York City. Very romantic. So, and nobody, you know, really guessed anything because we were always together anyway as friends. And the week that at HUC you give your quote-unquote senior sermon, your major sermon that gets critiqued by the whole community. You give that in your 4th year of rabbinical school. Then in your 5th year, you write your thesis. And your thesis is due in March, and in order to be placed in a congregation, you have to have already turned in your in order to go through the interview process, you have to have turned in your thesis. So thesis was due sometime in the middle of March. And my senior sermon was sometime in the middle of March. And so my parents came into New York to hear my sermon, and they took me out to dinner, and our friend Gail Pomerantz, who was by then in David's class because she had not postponed her ordination by going through the education program. So she was now David's in her 5th year as well, and she and David actually were co-interns at Central Synagogue in New York, so they were very good friends. And so Gail came out to dinner with my parents and with me. She had already finished her thesis, and David, of course, had not, because neither one of us ever finished anything until the last minute. And so Gail and I were in a cab with my parents, and she was telling us where she was going to be interviewing for positions for the following year. And she got to Westfield, New Jersey, and my father pipes up and says, "Westfield, New Jersey, is that Rabbi still there? Rabbi Jack Stern?" And I'm thinking, okay, because Rabbi Jack Stern is David's father. And I'm thinking, how does my father know my secret boyfriend's father? And of course, and my parents had heard David's name because we were always doing things together or whatever. And so my father proceeds to tell us, and of course by that time Jack Stern had been in Scarsdale, New York for about 20 years. He hadn't been in Westfield for a long time. But that when my father was a young man after he graduated from college and he was working in New York, he had a college fraternity brother who lived in Great Neck. And David's father was an assistant rabbi in Great Neck, and he ran the singles program. And so my father's fraternity brother had brought him to something in Great Neck, and he and my father-in-law had hit it off, and they were very good friends in the 50s. And in fact, when my father went to Korea in the war, he brought back coasters from Korea for my father-in-law, which my father-in-law still had. So we're sitting there thinking, you know, this was just incredible that they knew each other. And so we get to the restaurant. It was before the days of cell phones, and I go down to the payphone, and I call David, who's hard at work writing his thesis. And I said, "David, call your father and ask him if he remembers a guy named Lou Wint." Lou Wint was the fraternity brother who connected my father and my father-in-law. And so David calls his father and says, "Dad, do you remember a guy named Lou Wint from Great Neck?" And his dad says, "Yeah, he was a friend of a guy named Jack Kasten." So they had lost touch, you know, many years before. They had known each other before either of them was married. And so when we got together, when David and I got together and eventually got married, that was a way for the two old friends to reconnect. And my parents and my in-laws have been very, very, very close friends as well, which is really very, very lovely. Doesn't always happen that way, so we feel very, very grateful.
So when were you married?
We were married in 1990. David was ordained in 1989, and he came to Dallas to work with Shelley Zimmerman, and I was not happy about the idea of coming to Dallas. I was a coast person. I had lived on the East Coast, the West Coast. I was not interested in living in Texas, had never been to Texas, and we were not even engaged at the time, but I was not happy about that decision. But it was his decision, and as it turns out, it was a great one. But I was in my last year of rabbinical school, so David came in 1989. He proposed, that year I served a congregation in New Iberia, Louisiana, so I would fly down to New Iberia once a month. I would stop in Dallas and visit him and continue on to New Iberia. So during the high holidays, in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, David surprised me. He actually, another little connection that, I don't know if any of you remember Max and Rosa Goldblatt from Dallas. He was, I think, a city councilman, and their daughter has lived in New Iberia for a long time, and Leah and Stephen Lahaski. And so Leah and Stephen and Rosa and Max helped David figure out a way to come surprise me and propose while I was in New Iberia for the high holidays. So we got engaged in New Iberia, Louisiana, and that was in the fall of 1989, and then I was ordained in, I guess, May of 1990, and then we were married in June, and I moved to Dallas.
And what were your impressions of Dallas when you moved here?
You know, it was hot, wasn't very pretty, but nice people. I mean, very, very nice people from the very beginning. Everybody was really wonderful to us and very welcoming and helpful, and we're very happy that we were here. And you know, it became clear that we could do a lot of things here because there were so few Jewish professionals. That also was a liability in certain ways, because our options for personal development and rabbinic colleagues and all of that were not as great, although we had wonderful colleagues, of course, in Liza and Keith Stern when we first came here, and we've had a close relationship with them ever since. And then, of course, others have come since, Debbie Robbins and her husband Larry, and all of the other rabbis who've been at Temple Emmanuel and elsewhere since we came in 1990, 89, 90.
How do you think the city's changed since then?
Well, it's expanded considerably. You know, never went north of, well, we lived north of LBJ, so I shouldn't say we never went north of LBJ, but if ever we were to do anything social or fun, you know, everything was always south, and now everything is everywhere. You know, you go everywhere. I think, so it feels like Dallas has just developed, you know, particularly north, like a lot of our life now is north rather than south. You know, I was having this conversation a few days ago that when we first moved here, there was a lot of interest in interfaith dialogue and intercommunal dialogue. I remember being part of a community discussion, a black, white, brown discussion that went on for a couple of years, actually, that would meet on a regular basis that, you know, no longer exists. I was very, very fondly thinking about Aunt Sikora and what kinds of work she did with the Jewish Community Relations Council to connect the Jewish community in important ways to the non-Jewish community. Those efforts have really fallen by the way. You know, they exist in with certain individual relationships, but communal relationships, I think, there has not been as much of an investment, and I think that's part of, you know, the trend that we see in our society in general, with people being less connected to their institutions and their communities, and so there's less to build from when you want to reach out or to have a dialogue. But you know, I think that those kinds of things have changed.
Mm-hmm. When you arrived in Dallas, how did you envision your career going?
Well, when I first came here, I actually took on 3 positions, and that was somewhat self-defense. I thought, okay, David's going to be really busy. I know that for a fact. I'm going to be busy too. And I'm just not going to give myself a lot of time to think about what else I could be doing somewhere else. And I had some great opportunities here. So when I first came, I was part-time assistant director of the UAHC with Larry Jakovsky, and the other half, it was kind of half there, half at SMU, starting there from Hillel. And so those were my main positions, and then I served a small the Carrollton congregation near Tamid. I went out there about every 2 weeks and did various kinds of things with them. So I was busy. I just kept very busy, and I really enjoyed my work at SMU. I enjoyed my work at the UAHC as well, but we wanted to start a family, and it involved a considerable amount of traveling, and that didn't seem like a long-term realistic position. So after 2 years at the union, I was offered the position of assistant chaplain, I think, at SMU. Bob Cooper retired, and that position became open, and Will Finnan, chaplain at SMU, invited me to apply for that position. So at that point, I was very eager to do that, and I became the associate chaplain, assistant associate. I think I started out as assistant, ended up as associate chaplain, and that was half-time, and then my other half was the Hillel. So I was in one place basically full-time, and served in Carrollton 1 more year until Jacob was born, and then I retired from that as well. So I was focused at SMU for most of my years in Dallas, and I really enjoyed that a lot.
Mm-hmm. What was it like working with students, Jewish students, in a university that has Methodist in its name?
It was challenging. You know, you quickly adjust your expectations to the reality that most highly identified Jews would go to a place with a larger Jewish population in somewhere other than Dallas, where you had more communal opportunity for involvement Jewishly. But what I also learned fairly quickly was that that for some kids, being in a place where they really felt like they were a minority intensified their identification with Judaism. So that was an opportunity as well. And so it was nice to be able to provide a place for Jewish students who didn't even necessarily know they were that interested in identifying when they came on campus, a place for them to feel connected, connect them to the Dallas Jewish community, and to also help translate Jewish life to others on campus.
Now, you also worked at Wise Academy.
The last 3 years I worked at Wise Academy.
And what were your feelings about the school and what the students were learning in that kind of environment?
Can I take a minute? Can you turn
Sure.
Got it. Pause.
This is at Wise Academy.
Well, my first experiences were as part of a proto board, which was established before the school actually was formed. And I served on that, and then the next experience I had was when my son, Jacob, became a first grader at Wise. That was in, I guess, 1978. It was 78. It was 1999, I think, 8 or 9. He was not in the first class of students that began, but in the second, he was part of the second year of the school. And then my daughter Nina started the next year in first grade. So I was a parent. And then after the original director, Susan Horowitz, left and Karen Edelstein was hired, she asked me to come as director of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. And I served in that position for 2 years, and then my position changed somewhat and my title changed to campus rabbi for the last year. I think that Wise was a school that had a lot of potential. There were a lot of people who really would have liked it to succeed. I think that it was in some ways an idea whose time had not yet come. I think Jewish day schools are very, very important, and the Reform community really needs day schools in order to create a strong, identified community, Reform Jewish community for the future, and a Reform Jewish leadership for the future. So it's sad that it didn't work, and but I also think that a lot of good things did come out of it, and hopefully those things will be capitalized upon in the future.
Tell us about your family.
My family. You mean my
Children.
little family?
Yes.
My own family?
Yes.
Well, David and I have 3 children. Of course, David is my husband. And so we've got the Temple Emmanuel family too, which we love. And we have 3 kids. Jacob was born in 1993. He became a bar mitzvah in March. He's in 8th grade at Green Hill, and he's currently in football season, and he's a big football star, so he's in his element right now. He loves sports, and he loves to travel, and we are enjoying getting to know him as an adult, as he grows into adulthood and starts to be able to communicate more like an adult, and it's a lot of fun. So that's Jacob, and then we have Nina, who just turned 12, and she is a 7th grader at Levine Academy. And she's our social butterfly. She loves her friends, and she loves to be with her friends. She's very creative, and she's very graceful, and she did gymnastics for a long time. She's not doing that any longer, but she's very graceful, very passionate person, great artist. And then we have Lily, who is 7. And she is now in 2nd grade at the Levine Academy, and she's running the world, or trying to run the world.
And what suggestions would you make to other parents regarding their children's Jewish education?
I think that the biggest advice, or the best advice I would give, is to do their best to create a Jewish community for their family. Different people make different choices about Jewish education, and frankly, I mean, in terms of Jewish education, in some ways one might say that day school is the way to go, and I think that there's definitely a strong case to be made for day schools, both in terms of the immersion into Jewish knowledge and Jewish life, and a Jewish calendar and rhythm of life, which you can't get anywhere else in the United States. I mean, if you move to Israel, that's another story, but here you really only get that if you're in a Jewish day school. So that's a very strong endorsement. Although even that, in and of itself, isn't enough. I mean, you need to have a family, a home environment that also is at least aware of those cycles and seasons and rituals and commitments, and you also, I think, really need a community, whether it be through your synagogue or through your neighborhood or through the other people you met at your preschool, where you can share simchas and holidays. And you know, some people do have local family where they do that, and that suffices. Some people have friends and that suffices, and some people have both. But I think that you can't do it alone, basically, as parents. We can't do it alone. And it takes some work to find people who share the same commitment. One of the most rewarding things I'm doing right now, I mean, this year I've said that this is my year for my midlife crisis. I don't know how long it'll take. It may take more than a year, but I'm not working. But I am teaching one Melton class, and it's a class made up of preschool moms, and I teach on Thursday mornings. And I'm so impressed with the fact that they've committed. This is the second year of the program, so they've already gone through a full year of every week coming to study for 2 hours on Thursday mornings, and this is their second year. They're back again, doing it again, and they've created a community through that, and also learn more about what it means to have a Jewish community. And so I'm so thrilled that I was asked to do this class, because it really, strengthens my belief that really is part of the key, that that you share those kinds of commitments with other people who are going through some of the same things that you're going through as parents.
Okay. What are you most proud of, and who are your role models?
Well, I think that I'm most proud of sort of forging a life in Dallas, and creating a real life for myself and my family here. It was not a place that I would have ever expected to be as I was growing up. I moved here when I was 30, and I'm very proud of the community that I'm a part of, and the friends that do come together to support each other, and and community members that come together to support each other. And I feel like hopefully I've been a part of that. I just saw Liza Stern a couple of weeks ago at the wedding of good friends here in Dallas, and she definitely is a role model for me in terms of keeping a perspective on being a rabbi and being part of a family and being human. So she is definitely a role model. Ruth Laurie is a great role model for me. She's a great friend. She has been a spiritual guide for me, and just a model of what it means to be committed to family, be committed to community, and also to be committed to oneself in a way that really benefits everyone else, but especially me. My father-in-law is a great role model. He is now 80, turned 80 this year. He's been a rabbi for over 50 years now. And he, again, is a person who, as committed as he is to his work as a rabbi and to the Jewish people and to Jewish ideals, he also is a very down-to-earth, able to communicate kind of person. And actually the biggest thing I've learned from him, which I'm still working on, but he's really able to express what he needs, ask for what he needs, identify what he needs, ask for what he needs, and that's something that I have a hard time with, and I think a lot of us have a hard time with. So he's been a great role model as well.
Is there anything you would like to add?
We're out of film.
Midrash.
The Beit Midrash was an idea that we came up with Jordan Offsire and Mo Stein and I had this idea, it must have been around 1999, something like that. Somewhere around that time. And we thought it was time for Dallas to have an independent adult education venue that was more academic in nature, and that we had some university professors and other potential instructors of high caliber, because this was after Joys of Jewish Learning had been dismantled, and the JCC wasn't really engaging in adult learning, and there was not a lot of communal learning at the time other than data, and we felt like there needed to be some kind of other alternative to data. And so so we had this idea, and we worked on it for a long time, and I became the first president of the board, and I was the president of the board for a long time as well. But Mo Stein really kept it going and was the heart and soul and got the professors, and you know, I mean, I did some of it, Reed Heller did some of it, but he was the motor for the Beit Midrash, and always has been, and continues. He continues to be very involved. I am no longer involved, but I think they're doing great stuff, and even with the other alternatives that are now available, which are more than there were, we have Melton now, and we have the community Kollel up at the Schultz-Rosenberg campus. So there are some other options, but the Beit Midrash persists. So I think it's to Mo's credit, really.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I'm very honored to be part of this project and to be part of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. So thank you.
Thank you.
Could we get a resume or something that has all your dates and